nodes. They're pretty small, so you may not be able to see them. But they're meant to represent names. Okay, so the original network has some names, and naive anonymization basically strips the names off the graph and releases the graph on the right, which has maybe random numbers in place of the names. So this naively anonymized graph is essentially an isomorphic copy of the graph. So it's perfect for studying topological properties of the graph. I could measure path length distributions, and I could simulate processes on this network, and there would be no loss of information there. Unfortunately, this type of anonymization is not secure. So the problems that can result from naive anonymization is that one problem is that the adversary can have some external information. So I may know that Bob is a member of this community, so he's in that graph somewhere, although he's not identified. But I can look using the information I have about him and try to find matching nodes. There might be one matching node, or if I know a little bit less about Alice, or Alice, the information I know about Alice is less distinguishing, I may have multiple candidates for Alice, but I may be able to narrow those candidates down. Now, if I re-identified Bob and I re-identified Alice in the naively anonymized graph, then I could just inspect the graph and see whether there is an edge between them, and I would have disclosed an identified edge, which may be a sensitive fact. Okay, so we did some empirical measurements when we first started working in this area. We spent a while trying to understand the extent to which the structure of an individual in a graph, particularly the local structure around an individual, acts as an identifier. How unique is your structure in a population? And if I knew a little bit about your structure, how successful would I be in finding you in that naively anonymized graph? I won't go over this in a lot of detail, but the bar chart is representing the success in re-identifying the population. The H1 along the bottom there is essentially meant to represent a degree signature, and the H1 signature is just the node's degree. So if I knew degree of each person in the graph, how many people look unique with respect to degree? The red part indicates uniquely identified individuals, and it's almost no one. So almost no one has a unique degree in the Friendster network, which is quite a large network. But if I go to H2, which is not only an individual's degree, but their neighbors' degrees, then I have more information about each individual. And that information is highly distinguishing. In fact, about half of the individuals in the Friendster network are uniquely identified by a kind of signature which reports their degree and their neighbor's degree. So that I've gone one step out, and I can go further steps out by refining these signatures, neighbors' degrees, and so forth, and I get more specific information. Okay, so that's some empirical evidence that suggests that structure is highly identifying in networks and is going to lead to attacks on naive anonymization. There are other attacks that have been proposed in the literature, and I'll mention them quickly because they're interesting attacks. In the World Wide Web conference in 2007, Backstrom proposed an active attack. An active attack, question? Yes. Half of them are uniquely identified. The other half may only be identified. You can sort of identify more than one possible match for those individuals. And those colors, I didn't explain this that carefully, but those colors are representing the size of the set of candidates that you get when you try to match that individual. So the yellow is a portion of the population that ends up being identified to within 5 or 10 candidates. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So the background you have for this bar is accurate background, or like could be some error, like because in this such a big network,
Yeah.
It's not like if you a node has 12 degrees.
Yeah.
It's not likely you just know it has 12 degrees. Maybe you know that the degree is around maybe 9 to 15.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So the speaker is pointing out, the question is pointing out that our information may not be may not be precise. I mean, oftentimes the background information that you have could have some errors in it. So if I go back to, did I skip over this? In this example, you may ask, what do I mean by saying that Bob has 8 neighbors? Do I mean Bob has exactly 8 neighbors and no other neighbors? Or do I mean that I know that Bob has these 8 neighbors and there may be more neighbors? That's an example of having some approximate knowledge. And we studied that, and I'm not presenting that in this talk, the results, but we did look at the difference between the success in identifying people, and it does have an impact. So you will be less successful with approximate knowledge, and it's a good point. Okay, so I wanted to mention this active attack. So an active attack is an attack in which the attacker can inject information into the data set before it's anonymized. So think of an online social network in which you can create new identities, and you can even create edges between identities. And the attacker will therefore modify the graph, and then it will be naively anonymized, and then the attacker will do some inference on the resulting graph. So what they proposed was an attack in which they create a small set of identities, the blue nodes, and they wire them randomly together. They just create a small random graph there in the data set, and then they choose 2 targets, the orange nodes, and the goal of the attack is to identify whether those 2 nodes are connected. And so they wire that funny subgraph, the blue subgraph, to those 2 orange nodes. Then the anonymization takes place. So they strip all the names off and they publish this isomorphic copy. And then the attacker's challenge is to find the blue subgraph in the graph. And then using that subgraph, they just go to the orange nodes and inspect whether they're connected. So what they showed in that paper was that the blue graph can be actually very small. You don't need a lot of blue nodes. If you just wire them together randomly, with high probability you will be able to find that blue subgraph in the much larger graph. And furthermore, there's some subtleties like you'd like to be able to do that and not get detected by anyone who's trying to stop you. So you can look at that paper. Another more recent paper was a kind of global attack in which one big network, I think it was a network derived from Twitter, was assumed naively anonymized, and then the background knowledge that was used was a network derived from Flickr, a different social network with some overlap in the participation. And that was assumed to be an identified network, and then they try to run an attack where they kind of do an overlay of the 2 networks to re-identify individuals. Okay, so I'm just going over those briefly to give you some idea of the subtleties of what can happen. So, naive anonymization, the big picture point is naive anonymization has a lot of flaws, and it's not a safe method for protecting networks. So people have been trying to do better things. One theme of the work has been to create similarity in the structure of the nodes in the network. So that Sigmod 08 paper tried to bin degrees and make every different degree that occurs in the graph have at least k other people that share that degree. And it provided some resistance to an attacker who has degree-based knowledge. Other people have tried randomizing edges in the graph. Okay? Other people, including us actually, have tried clustering the nodes in a graph and then reporting statistics about those clusters, then allowing an analyst to sample from that graph-like object and analyze the samples. So actually a few other authors have also considered clustering and summarization methods. So I'm not going to talk about those techniques in detail. They're all instances of what I call data publishing. So we've got the original network on one side of the line, and we publish a graph or a graph-like object that's distorted in some way for privacy. Okay, so that has some good points and some bad points. So from the standpoint of ease of use, it's good because the analysts want a graph to hold on to. They don't want to just run a one-time query, really. They want to do knowledge discovery on the graph, or they want to refine their algorithms as they study the graph. So it's nice if they can have a graph to hold on to. Unfortunately, these data publishing techniques, most of them have relatively weak privacy guarantees, and it's quite difficult to make formal statements about the impact of the anonymization on the accuracy of specific tasks that you want to carry out. Also, the scalability is sometimes bad, especially with clustering large graphs is computationally hard to do. So what I'm going to talk about today is